Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is June the 19th, 2026, typically called Juneteenth. It's a holiday, right? And of course, it celebrates the uh, emancipation of, well, when Black Americans got to know that they were free. So I'm doing this video just to clarify because there's a checkered history, nebulous history concerning emancipation, right? Uh, Juneteenth is celebrated as the emancipation of Black Americans because it was signed into law on June 17, 2021. It became law June 17, 2021, under President Joe Biden. Uh, However, June 19, all right, 1865 wasn't when, and it's supposed to commemorate June 19, 1865, when the slaves in Galveston, Texas, knew that they were free, right? And of course, that wasn't when all the slaves knew, or the final slaves knew that they were free. So I'm going to give the checkered history. Um, so May 26, 1865, Confederate General of um, the Confederate General of the uh, Trans Mississippi, right? Trans Mississippi Army, General Kirby Smith, finally surrendered, right? But that wasn't the end of the Civil War. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, when General Robert Lee officially surrendered to uh, commanding general of the Union forces, General Ulysses Grant, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. So that was April 9, 1865, which basically brought the Civil War to an end. Yeah, on January the 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863. However, that Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all slaves, right, in the Union, in America. It didn't free all the slaves in America. So that 1863 Emancipation Proclamation only freed all enslaved people, right, in the Confederate states, Confederate South, that were in rebellion. All those states in the Confederate uh, under the Confederate Army that were in rebellion, right? Of course, and that included the slaves in Texas because they were in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, did not free slaves in the South, but that were loyal to the Union. Not all enslaved states, seceded, right? That included Maryland, right? Maryland, West Virginia, Missouri, Kentucky, and where Delaware, right? So those states that remained loyal to the Union, their slaves were not free, right? They were still enslaved. The African Americans, Black Americans, the enslaved population were not free by the Emancipation Proclamation of um, January 1st, 1863, issued by President Abraham Lincoln. It was so those slaves, right, in Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia were not free until after the war, right? After Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery and all forms of involuntary servitude all across the United States, right? Um, of course, there's a clause, right? There's a clause except for those who except except slavery, voluntary servitude remains for as a punishment for a crime for people who've been convicted, right, of a crime, right. So you see the fallout of that loophole in the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery across the Union. It would subsequently lead southern states, right, former rebellion seceding states who had gone back into the Union to enact the convict leasing, which led to the mass incarceration of formerly enslaved black people. And they were basically enslaved and leased off to companies to help rebuild, the South. And of course, we still suffer the blowback today with mass incarceration that disproportionately uh, incarcerates black people, right, in American prisons. That explains why America still has the largest incarcerated population in the world, right? Over 2.3 million people are incarcerated in the United States. And of course, they're disproportionately blacks, descendants of former African slaves. But in any event, I've done videos talking about mass incarceration today. I'm celebrating Juneteenth. So, importantly, in Galveston, Texas, right, the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, issued by President Abraham Lincoln, who had already been assassinated by the actor John Wilkes Booth, by June 19, uh, June 19, 1865. He'd already been assassinated after General Kirby Smith, right, of the Confederate Army for the Trans-Mississippi Army of the Confederates. After he finally surrendered. So he surrendered after, I guess, communications was slow back then. Lee surrendered first. Lee was the commanding general for the Confederates. So once he'd officially surrendered to Ulysses Grant on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, the war was really, for all intents and purposes, over. But some of the generals, still tried to hold out, or they hadn't received word, and they would formally do their surrender. So it was just a matter of formality. And in Galveston, Texas, the Confederate general there, Kirby Smith, would surrender to on May 26th, 1865. And after that, uh, uh, Major General Gordon Granger, right, of the Union Army, would, once he'd marched in, he would read from Proclamation Order number 3 and declare that all enslaved people are free. But this was in Galveston, Texas, and this was on June 19, 1865. So that's the history of Juneteenth. But there were still people who were enslaved in America, in, ironically, the loyal uh, the loyal slaveholding states. So the loyal slaveholding states that did not secede, um, you know, and get into the rebellion against the United States, the Union. That includes Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia. Those Black Americans there were still enslaved. So they were not free until December 6th, 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude across the United States. So that was when, for the first time, all the Africans were free. Now, something I wanted to mention is that with the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, that's on January 1st, 1863, something significant occurred. 200,000 African Americans, formerly enslaved Black Americans, joined the Union Army. So 200,000 Black Americans enlisted in the Union Army and fought, helped in the prosecution of the war. So you see that even during the Revolutionary Wars in 1776, Black Americans fought in the war on the side of the Americans, the rebels against the British. During the Civil War, once Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a large contingency of Black Americans fought in the war. 200,000 of them enlisted. Now, and I read the personal memoirs of President Ulysses Grant. Interestingly, he doesn't talk about his presidency. He talks about his prosecution of the war, of the Civil War. Mainly, he talks about his childhood, his biography, what led to him, and then he goes in detail about the prosecution of the war. Now, something he does, he praises the role of Black Americans as spies that were very significant and instrumental in winning the war. They worked as spies. They were brave. Some would, would escape and provide information on the terrain of the South, right, the slave holding South. In fact, um, when the Union Army took over a port, it was from the information, the intelligence provided by a former slave, a Black American, African American former slave that was instrumental, that was significant, pivotal. And Ulysses Grant also talked about how the contingency of contingent of Black soldiers were very brave, that they fought, died bravely, and it was to dispel myth. He was debunking derogatory, disparaging, um, you know, um, remarks that were being circulated in the newspapers about Black soldiers not being brave or not being able to fight or things like that. He said no, that they were extremely brave. They were very strategic, and so that's very significant. That once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, 200,000 African Americans enlisted and joined the Union Army. However, there was also a group of enslaved people, like in Galveston, Texas, who did not know for over 2 years that they were free, right? So they didn't know until the Major General of the Union Army who marched in, that's Major General Gordon Granger, when he read the uh, Proclamation Order number 3, telling the slaves in Galveston, Texas, that they were free. And this was June 19, 1865. So that's it. That's a history of Juneteenth. I thought I would just talk about that. And so there's been a lot of milestones. Importantly, when Black Americans were freed, they didn't try and go somewhere, go back to Africa. On Sundays, I normally I do a deep dive into the Bible, right? Because I'm a Bible student, right? I continue to be a student of the Bible, cover to cover, right? So and something that's part of Jewish history, Jewish identity, is the enslavement, the story of the enslavement in Egypt, and of course the Torah. The Torah comes, uh, uh, you know, after their freedom, right? After they were delivered from slavery, after 400 years of bondage in Egypt. Now, interestingly, they left Egypt. They didn't stay in Egypt. They left Egypt, right? And the Egyptians gave them gifts as they left, right? So they left and went to build their own lands. Now, African Americans did not leave America after being enslaved. They were free to leave, but they didn't leave. They chose to seek the full consummation of an exercise of their equal rights as American citizens. And we know how, um, the United States has also been proactive. And of course, there were the Reconstruction amendments. That includes the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery across the United States. There was a 14th Amendment that made not just African Americans citizens because they were born here, but also established, delineated what naturalized citizens are. And for other people to be able to immigrate and be naturalized citizens and equal citizens. So the 14th Amendment said they were equal citizens. It didn't create a new tier or a new class of a hierarchical, uh, uh, you know, classification of citizenship. No, it made citizenship equal. And of course, the 15th Amendment, which gave black males the right to vote. So those are the Reconstruction amendments. And of course, there's been the back and forth, the pendulum swing in rights and race relations. But African Americans have stayed. There was a time immigration was very xenophobic, and it was hostile to foreigners. And at some point that changed, right? Especially under President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1865. And that's why new African immigrants and others have been able to come and be equal citizens, naturalized, be equal citizens in America. But importantly, the reason why I was saying the issue about, I was trying to give the analogy concerning the children of Israel and when they departed from Egypt, uh, following their deliverance from 400 years of bondage, is the Egyptians gave them gifts. So I'm a supporter of reparations for ADOS or foundational Black Americans or uh, American descendants of slaves, but I mean the descendants of African slaves. I'm a supporter of that because there's still a lot of structural racism, right? Emancipation, the laws have not taken care of the structural racism that exists. And I just talked about how once slavery was abolished and there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment that said, well, slavery is abolished across, it's banned, and involuntary servitude is banned across the United States, except as punishment for a crime where, the individual has been convicted, right? So slavery's legal in prisons, right? And we see the fallout after that. There was mass convicts leasing of the newly freed Black Americans in the South, right? So, and the structural disparities that make uh, Black Americans vulnerable to mass incarceration is because of the um, lack of the resources to help them to be able to fully exercise the benefits of equal citizenship in the United States. My name is Oluro Timiosha. Happy Juneteenth. I will keep you posted. Thank you.